Pick the most ordinary human you can find, the council had said, and place him beside a queen. Somewhere above Earth's blue horizon, billions of eyes were watching the result. The Valorian Royal Assembly Hall floated in silence like a cathedral made of glass and starlight, its vast circular chamber suspended above a slow-turning planet whose clouds glowed pale silver under distant suns, and along the chamber walls thousands of observation windows shimmered with the faces of species from every corner of the known galaxy, diplomats, analysts, historians, entire civilizations leaning forward to witness what they believed would be a simple demonstration of superiority. Because today the Valorian Empire was conducting what they called the Royal Compatibility Trial, an ancient political ritual meant to prove that Valorians were the most stable rulers in a chaotic universe, yet this year the test included a strange new variable, a single representative from a species most galactic powers barely respected, humanity. The man chosen for that role did not look like history in the making. Daniel Carter stood alone on a transport platform beneath the towering palace station, his worn engineering jacket folded over one arm and a thin data contract still glowing in his hand, the station's docking bay stretching half a mile wide around him, filled with ships shaped like silver wings and quiet engines humming with restrained power, and Daniel felt very small inside it all, which made sense, because 48 hours ago he had been repairing coolant valves at a weather station in Nevada, a dusty desert facility where the wind tasted like sand and the nearest town was 30 miles away, and now somehow he was standing inside the capital of a star-faring empire because someone in a government office had decided that the best human to represent Earth in a galaxy-wide political experiment was a mechanical engineer who spent most of his days fixing equipment nobody else wanted to touch. Daniel adjusted the strap of the small tool bag at his side, the familiar weight of wrenches and diagnostic scanners oddly comforting compared to the polished alien machinery surrounding him, and he watched as the enormous doors of the docking chamber slowly opened with the quiet authority of something designed by minds that had been building empires for thousands of years, revealing a corridor that seemed to stretch forever, its floors smooth like black glass and its walls glowing with deep blue light that reminded him of ocean water seen from below. Somewhere above that corridor, cameras were already transmitting everything he did to half the galaxy. Daniel sighed softly and rubbed the back of his neck. Well, he muttered under his breath, this is gonna be weird. The announcement system responded immediately, its voice calm and melodic, echoing across the bay like a choir singing inside a cathedral. Human Representative Daniel Carter, you are requested to proceed to the royal residence level. Her Majesty awaits. Daniel glanced up at the towering station structure rising more than 2,000 feet above the docking floor, its curved spires reaching toward the stars like the ribs of some enormous metallic creature, and he couldn't help thinking about how strange the situation really was, because according to the contract glowing in his hand he wasn't here as a diplomat or soldier or scientist. He was here because the Valorian Empire wanted to study how a human behaved when forced to live beside absolute power for one full galactic year, 382 standard days, every conversation recorded, every decision analyzed, every mistake broadcast to worlds that had never even heard of Earth before last week. Most species expected the human to fail quickly. Some predicted embarrassment. A few predicted chaos. Daniel Carter predicted something simpler. He started walking down the glowing corridor, boots tapping softly against the glass-smooth floor, tool bag swinging lightly at his side, and as the massive doors sealed behind him he looked up at the endless blue light ahead and shrugged. Guess I'll just fix whatever breaks, he said quietly. What Daniel Carter did not know yet was that the first thing waiting to break was an empire. The corridor seemed longer the farther Daniel Carter walked, as if the palace station itself was quietly measuring him step by step, blue light sliding across the polished floor while distant machinery hummed somewhere deep inside the structure like a giant breathing slowly in its sleep. And Daniel kept his pace steady even though he knew every camera in the empire was probably zooming in on the human engineer who had been selected for the most unusual political experiment the galaxy had attempted in centuries. The air inside the corridor smelled faintly metallic, clean in a way that reminded him of high-altitude laboratories, and the temperature felt perfectly controlled, maybe 72 degrees Fahrenheit if his instincts were right, which meant the Valorians understood comfort even if they did not understand humans yet. As he walked, transparent panels along the walls flickered to life, displaying silent observers from distant worlds, tall crystalline beings with refracted bodies, feathered diplomats wrapped in gold fabric, quiet scholars whose eyes glowed like lanterns in dim rooms, entire civilizations watching a single human walk down a hallway as if history depended on the way he placed one boot in front of the other. Daniel noticed the screens but did not slow down. He had spent too many years fixing malfunctioning equipment to worry about being impressive. Machines did not care about appearances. They only cared about whether something worked. The corridor eventually opened into an elevator chamber the size of a basketball arena, a circular platform surrounded by thin rings of floating light, and the moment Daniel stepped onto the platform it lifted without a sound, rising upward through the center of the palace station faster than any elevator he had ever ridden back on Earth. The walls transforming into transparent glass as the chamber climbed past hundreds of interconnected levels filled with alien architecture that blended smooth organic curves with precise mechanical symmetry. Gardens floated inside suspended terraces where glowing plants drifted in slow spirals of light. Long bridges stretched across open-air chambers that were nearly a quarter-mile wide. It was beautiful in the quiet way advanced technology sometimes was, like something built by people who had solved most of their problems a long time ago. Daniel leaned slightly against the railing and watched the city inside the station move beneath him, wondering how many engineers had worked on this place and whether any of them had ever had to replace a faulty coolant pump at 3 a.m. during a desert dust storm. The platform slowed when it reached the highest levels of the station and finally stopped before a pair of enormous doors that stood nearly 40 feet tall, their surface etched with elegant patterns that glowed like starlight frozen inside metal. A voice spoke again from somewhere above him, calm and precise. Human Representative Daniel Carter. You are entering the residence of Queen Seralith of the Valorian Empire. Daniel exhaled quietly. He wiped his hands once on his jeans out of habit and adjusted the strap of his tool bag before the doors began to open with a deep mechanical whisper that echoed through the chamber like distant thunder rolling across mountains. The room beyond was not what he expected. Instead of a throne room or a hall full of officials, the chamber looked almost peaceful. Tall windows revealed the curve of a blue star burning far outside the station, its light washing the entire room in soft sapphire reflections, and in the center of that light stood a single figure. She was taller than Daniel by nearly a foot, her posture straight and perfectly balanced like someone trained from birth to command attention without raising her voice, and her skin carried the deep sapphire tone of Valorian royalty, smooth and luminous beneath the pale glow of the star outside the glass. Long silver hair flowed down her back like liquid metal and her eyes shone with a calm violet light that seemed to study him the way an astronomer studies a newly discovered planet. Daniel stopped about 10 feet away because that seemed like a respectful distance and he gave a small nod, unsure what the correct royal greeting was supposed to be in a situation like this. The Queen did not return the gesture. She simply observed him for several quiet seconds while the entire galaxy waited for the first words spoken between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and clear, carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed by entire star systems. So this is the human they have chosen. Daniel scratched lightly at the side of his jaw and shrugged with the faintest smile. I guess so. Queen Seralith tilted her head slightly as if evaluating a machine that had just produced an unexpected result. The trial begins now, she said calmly. For the next 382 days you will live inside this palace as my designated counterpart. Your behavior will be observed by every member world of the Valorian Alliance. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the scale of that statement, then he glanced around the massive chamber again and pointed casually toward a faint flicker of light near the ceiling where a maintenance panel seemed to be malfunctioning. By the way, he said, I think one of your power regulators up there is blinking wrong. The Queen followed his gaze toward the ceiling. For the first time since he entered the room, her expression changed slightly. And in that small moment, somewhere across the galaxy, a few observers leaned closer to their screens. Queen Seralith continued looking toward the faint blinking light near the ceiling, the soft sapphire glow of the distant star reflecting across her smooth blue skin while the enormous chamber remained completely silent, and somewhere beyond those tall windows half the galaxy waited for her reaction to something no one had expected from the human representative. Daniel Carter shifted his weight slightly and squinted up at the maintenance panel again, the small diagnostic instincts he had built over years of engineering work already mapping possible causes in his head. The light was not just blinking. It was blinking unevenly, a tiny hesitation between pulses that suggested a regulator cycling incorrectly. Back on Earth he had seen the same pattern when a thermal buffer started drifting out of alignment. Nothing dramatic. Just the kind of problem that slowly made machines tired. The Queen finally spoke again, her voice calm but edged with curiosity. That panel regulates energy distribution for this entire chamber. It has been functioning without interruption for 612 standard cycles. Daniel nodded slowly. Yeah. Machines like to remind you they exist around that point. He slipped the tool bag from his shoulder and crouched briefly to check the diagnostic scanner attached to the side pocket, the motion casual enough that several observers across the galaxy probably leaned closer to their screens again. Queen Seralith watched him without moving. You believe it is malfunctioning? Daniel straightened and shrugged lightly. I believe it is about to. There is a difference. The Queen studied his face as if trying to determine whether the human was joking, but Daniel had already stepped toward the curved wall beneath the ceiling panel, examining the architecture like a mechanic walking around the hood of a truck that had started making strange noises. The wall itself was nearly 30 feet tall, smooth silver alloy shaped with elegant precision, but Daniel noticed a narrow service ladder hidden between two structural ridges, the kind of detail only engineers or maintenance crews usually bother to include. He pointed toward it. That ladder go all the way up there. Queen Seralith followed his gesture with a faint narrowing of her violet eyes. It does. Daniel gave a small nod and started climbing before anyone could object, his boots tapping softly against the metal rungs as he moved upward through the quiet blue light of the chamber, the entire scene probably looking strange from the perspective of the observation feeds. The royal compatibility trial had barely begun and the human participant was already halfway up a maintenance ladder inside the palace ceiling. Daniel reached the top in less than a minute and crouched beside the panel, opening the thin casing with a small magnetic driver from his tool bag while a swirl of soft golden circuitry flickered inside like a tiny sunrise. He whistled quietly. Well, there is your problem. The regulator coil was cycling half a millisecond late every rotation. Tiny. Almost invisible. But over time that kind of delay could ripple through an entire energy network. Daniel adjusted a small alignment bracket with the careful patience of someone who had spent years fixing delicate equipment that no one else wanted to touch, then he tightened the panel again and climbed back down the ladder. When his boots touched the floor he brushed a little dust from his palms and glanced up at the ceiling where the blinking light had already settled into a smooth steady rhythm. Queen Seralith noticed the change immediately. The light no longer flickered. It pulsed evenly like a calm heartbeat. You corrected it. Daniel shrugged again and slid the driver back into his bag. It was not broken yet. Just tired. For a moment the Queen did not answer. She looked from the stable light above them back to the human standing a few feet away holding a worn canvas tool bag that probably cost less than one decorative plate in the palace. Around them the quiet observation screens continued transmitting the moment to thousands of distant civilizations. Finally she spoke, slower this time. Human Daniel Carter. Daniel looked up. Yeah. Queen Seralith tilted her head slightly, her silver hair shifting in the pale starlight behind her. The trial was designed to study your behavior. Daniel gave a small half-smile. Sounds about right. The Queen studied him for another long second before speaking again. You repaired a system that was not yet broken. Daniel nodded once. That is usually the best time to fix things. The Queen looked back toward the ceiling again, her violet eyes reflecting the steady pulse of the regulator light, and somewhere in the quiet networks of the Valorian Empire the first analysts began to realize something unexpected about the human engineer living inside their palace. He did not act like someone trying to impress a queen. He acted like someone who simply noticed when things needed fixing. The steady pulse of the regulator light continued glowing above the chamber ceiling like a calm mechanical heartbeat, and for several quiet seconds Queen Serelith simply stood there studying the human engineer who had corrected a flaw in her palace within the first minutes of his arrival. The silence was not uncomfortable. It felt more like the pause that happens when two very different minds begin realizing they are observing the same problem from completely different directions. Daniel Carter shifted the tool bag back onto his shoulder and glanced once more toward the ceiling just to make sure the pulse stayed even. Years of working with complicated systems had trained him to watch for patterns. Machines always told the truth if you listened carefully enough. The Queen finally moved. She turned slowly toward the tall glass windows that revealed the burning blue star outside the palace station, its light pouring into the chamber like an ocean of soft sapphire fire, and Daniel noticed how naturally the light framed her silhouette, almost as if the architecture itself had been designed to remind every visitor who ruled this place. The royal compatibility trial requires observation of behavior under shared living conditions, Queen Serelith said after a moment, her voice calm and precise. For the next 382 days you will reside within this palace as my assigned counterpart. Daniel nodded once. Yeah. I read that part in the contract. The Queen turned her head slightly. You appear unusually calm for someone placed inside a foreign empire under continuous observation. Daniel considered that for a second. Back home I spent 6 months fixing wind turbines in a place where the temperature hit 115 degrees Fahrenheit and the nearest restaurant was 40 miles away. Compared to that, this is pretty comfortable. For the first time a faint expression passed across the Queen's face. It was not quite amusement, but it was close enough that a few observers watching the transmission probably noticed. She began walking across the chamber floor, the long lines of her silver hair moving gently behind her while Daniel followed a few steps back without thinking much about the protocol of walking beside a monarch who technically ruled 17 star systems. The corridor beyond the chamber opened into the inner levels of the palace, and Daniel quickly realized the station was less like a throne complex and more like a massive living ecosystem. Gardens stretched across floating terraces where luminous plants drifted slowly in the air like glowing jellyfish. Streams of clean water moved through narrow channels built into the architecture, feeding hydroponic trees that grew 20 feet tall beneath artificial sunlight. Quiet attendants moved through the halls maintaining systems so advanced they almost looked magical. Daniel slowed near one of the terraces where a circular fountain created soft ripples of silver light across the stone floor. The sound reminded him of mountain streams he had visited as a kid during summer camping trips with his father. Nice water circulation system, he said. Queen Serelith stopped beside him. This palace was constructed 3 centuries ago by the finest architects of the Valorian Empire. Daniel crouched slightly near the fountain edge and studied the flow pattern for a moment. Yeah. I can tell. Whoever designed the filtration loop knew what they were doing. The Queen looked down at him again with quiet curiosity. You evaluate architecture as if it were machinery. Daniel stood up and dusted his hands lightly. Everything is machinery if you follow the pipes far enough. The Queen did not respond immediately. She simply watched him the way a scientist might watch an unfamiliar but interesting species interacting with a new environment. After several seconds she continued walking toward the inner residence halls and Daniel followed again, his boots echoing softly across polished floors that probably cost more than the entire weather station he used to maintain on Earth. When they reached the entrance to the residential wing the Queen stopped once more. These quarters will be yours for the duration of the trial. Daniel stepped inside and looked around. The room was enormous. A wide glass wall revealed a breathtaking view of the starfield beyond the station. The bed looked large enough to sleep 6 people comfortably. Several sleek alien consoles glowed quietly along the walls like patient computers waiting to be used. Daniel set his tool bag down beside the door and turned slowly in a full circle taking in the entire space. Well, he said finally. This is definitely an upgrade from the Nevada desert. Queen Serelith remained standing in the doorway watching him carefully. Human Daniel Carter. Daniel looked back toward her. Yeah. She spoke slowly, measuring the words. Most individuals placed inside this palace attempt to impress me. Daniel scratched the back of his neck and gave a small shrug. Honestly, I am mostly trying not to break anything expensive. The queen studied him again for a long moment. Then she quietly said something that none of the observers expected. That may prove to be the most impressive behavior of all. Daniel Carter spent the first evening inside the Valorian palace doing something that none of the royal observers had predicted he would do. He unpacked slowly. Not ceremonially, not nervously, just the quiet routine of a man who had moved between temporary job sites for most of his adult life. The enormous room glowed softly with the light of distant stars beyond the glass wall while he placed a few simple belongings onto a polished table that probably cost more than a small house back on Earth. A folded photograph of his mother standing beside an old pickup truck. A weathered notebook filled with sketches of machinery. A compact diagnostic scanner with a cracked corner that had survived at least 3 different work contracts. The palace room itself felt perfectly controlled at 72 degrees Fahrenheit with air so clean it almost smelled like rain before a storm. Daniel walked slowly along the glass wall and looked out into space where the palace station floated like a shining city among the stars. Far below, long docking arms extended like silver branches while dozens of starships drifted in quiet orbit. Somewhere in those ships were ambassadors, analysts, and scholars still watching the human experiment unfold in real time. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck and muttered softly to himself. That is a lot of witnesses for a guy who fixes air filters. The door behind him opened with a soft mechanical whisper. Daniel turned and saw Queen Seralith step into the room, her tall figure outlined by the cool blue light of the corridor. She did not appear surprised to see him standing near the window, but her eyes moved slowly across the small collection of human objects he had placed on the table. You carry very few possessions, she said calmly. Daniel shrugged. Hard to travel light if you own too much stuff. The queen walked farther into the room, her attention settling briefly on the photograph. Who is the female in that image? My mom, Daniel replied. The queen studied the picture more carefully. She appears proud. Daniel smiled faintly. She is proud of anyone who can keep an engine running longer than expected. Queen Seralith tilted her head slightly. Your species assigns emotional significance to mechanical success. Daniel laughed quietly. You would too if a broken engine could leave you stuck in the middle of nowhere. The queen remained silent for a moment as if considering that idea. Outside the glass wall the distant stars shifted slowly across the horizon of the station. Finally she spoke again. Earlier you repaired a system that was not failing. Why? Daniel leaned one shoulder lightly against the window frame and thought about the question. Because small problems grow if nobody notices them. Machines tell you when they need attention. Most people just do not listen. The queen watched him carefully. Valorian engineering philosophy prioritizes stability through perfect design. Daniel nodded. Sounds impressive. Does it work? The queen paused. For several centuries it has. Daniel gestured gently toward the ceiling somewhere beyond the walls where the regulator light continued its steady pulse. Even perfect systems get tired eventually. That is not a flaw. That is just time. The queen turned her gaze toward the star outside the window again. In the reflection of the glass Daniel could see the faint violet glow of her eyes studying the distant light as if measuring something far older than either of them. Your species appears comfortable acknowledging imperfection, she said quietly. Daniel shrugged again. We build things expecting them to break eventually. That way we are not surprised when they do. The queen slowly turned back toward him. And you intend to spend the next 382 days repairing imperfections in my palace. Daniel scratched lightly at his jaw and gave a small thoughtful nod. If I noticed them, probably. The queen studied him for several silent seconds. Across the galaxy, observers recorded the moment carefully. A human engineer standing beside a queen of 17 star systems, discussing maintenance like two technicians reviewing an old engine. Finally Queen Saralith spoke again, her voice softer than before. Human Daniel Carter. Daniel looked up. Yes. She glanced briefly at the tool bag resting beside the door. You may find that this palace contains more imperfections than you expect. Daniel followed her gaze toward the bag and smiled faintly. Good. Because that is usually where the interesting work starts. The palace station rotated slowly against the starfield while the artificial night cycle settled across the upper residence levels, and sometime around what Daniel Carter guessed was close to midnight Earth time the quiet systems of the Valorian palace began their usual pattern of soft mechanical whispers, pumps adjusting pressure, thermal exchangers balancing heat between decks, and long streams of energy moving through conduits hidden inside walls older than many civilizations watching the broadcast. Daniel had been asleep for almost 2 hours when a faint irregular sound woke him. It was subtle. A quiet metallic ticking that did not match the smooth rhythm of the palace systems he had already begun to notice during his first evening. Years of engineering work had trained his brain to recognize when a machine was speaking the wrong language. Daniel opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling for a moment, listening carefully while the room remained dim under the soft glow of the star outside the glass wall. There it was again. Tick. Pause. Tick tick. A small hesitation inside the pattern. Daniel sighed quietly and sat up on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face once before reaching automatically for the diagnostic scanner resting on the table beside his notebook. Somewhere across the galaxy, observers who monitored the continuous feed noticed the human moving through the room in the middle of the palace night cycle. Daniel slipped his boots on and stepped into the corridor outside his quarters, the polished hallway empty except for a few dim light panels guiding the way through the residence wing. The sound was clearer here. A faint vibration traveling through the wall panels about 20 feet down the corridor. Daniel crouched beside the wall and pressed the scanner against the surface, watching the small display flicker with energy readings. Low-frequency resonance. Probably a circulation pump drifting out of alignment. Nothing dangerous. But definitely annoying if left alone. Daniel stood and followed the faint vibration toward a narrow service door half hidden behind a decorative column. The door opened automatically when he touched the panel. Beside it, revealing a maintenance chamber filled with quiet humming equipment, silver pipes running along the ceiling and floor while a series of filtration pumps rotated steadily inside a transparent housing about the size of a refrigerator. One of them was slightly off balance. Daniel leaned closer and nodded to himself. Yeah. That will do it. The imbalance was tiny, barely noticeable unless someone happened to be listening for it, but over time it would cause the pump bearings to wear down faster than expected. Daniel placed the scanner on a nearby shelf and pulled a small alignment tool from his bag, loosening the outer bracket with careful movements until the vibration slowly faded into a smooth steady hum. When he finished, the chamber felt quiet again, the entire system running with the calm efficiency it had probably enjoyed for decades before the drift began. Daniel tightened the last bolt and leaned back against the wall for a second, satisfied. You are adjusting the palace infrastructure again. The voice came from the doorway behind him. Daniel turned and saw Queen Saralith standing in the corridor, her tall silhouette framed by the pale lighting of the residence hall. Daniel gave a small shrug. That pump was making a noise. The Queen stepped into the chamber slowly, her violet eyes studying the filtration system now humming quietly. This maintenance schedule is performed by automated service drones every 80 hours. Daniel nodded. They probably did not catch the imbalance yet. It was subtle. The Queen watched the pump for several seconds before speaking again. You left your quarters in the middle of the palace rest cycle to repair a sound that most individuals would not have noticed. Daniel leaned one shoulder against the equipment housing and smiled faintly. Engineers sleep better when machines stop complaining. The Queen looked at him in silence for a moment, then shifted her gaze toward the quiet system once more. Throughout the palace, hundreds of sensors had already confirmed the improvement in the circulation network. Somewhere far away in the Valorian observation chambers, analysts recorded another unexpected entry in the behavioral logs of the human representative. Daniel picked up his scanner and slid the tool back into his bag before walking toward the door again. As he passed the Queen, he paused briefly and gestured toward the pump behind them. Should run smooth now for a while. Queen. Seralith did not move immediately. She remained standing beside the quiet machinery, the soft hum reflecting in her violet eyes. Human Daniel Carter, she said after a moment. Daniel stopped in the corridor and turned slightly. Yes. The Queen considered her next words carefully. The trial was designed to observe how a human behaves under royal scrutiny. Daniel gave a tired half-smile. So far it mostly involves fixing things that squeak. The Queen looked once more at the silent pump, then back toward the human walking away down the corridor. And for the first time since the trial began, Queen Seralith began to suspect that the Valorian Empire might not fully understand what kind of experiment they had started. Morning inside the Valorian palace did not arrive with sunlight. It arrived with light gradually warming across the interior gardens as the station rotated into alignment with the blue star beyond the glass horizon. The artificial dawn spread slowly through the upper terraces, illuminating suspended walkways, quiet fountains, and rows of luminous plants that unfolded their glowing petals as if greeting the beginning of a new cycle. Daniel Carter woke earlier than the palace systems expected. Years of working maintenance contracts had trained his body to rise when machinery did. The room was still calm at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, the air circulating with silent precision through vents hidden inside the curved walls. For a few seconds he simply sat on the edge of the bed listening to the palace breathing. Pump steady. Power flow balanced. The circulation system he had adjusted during the night now hummed with smooth confidence somewhere beneath the floor. Daniel nodded once to himself. Good. He dressed quickly, pulled on his boots, and grabbed the familiar tool bag before stepping into the corridor outside his quarters. The residence level looked different in the morning light cycle. Tall windows poured pale sapphire illumination across the floors while distant service drones floated quietly along the ceiling tracks performing their scheduled inspections. Daniel walked slowly along the hallway, studying the architecture the way a mechanic studies the layout of an unfamiliar engine. Pipes ran behind the decorative panels. Thermal exchangers hid beneath the garden terraces. Whoever built this place had known their craft. The smell of warm water and plant life drifted faintly from the hydroponic gardens ahead. When Daniel stepped onto the terrace level he found Queen Seralith already there. She stood near the fountain he had noticed the previous evening, the gentle movement of water casting shifting reflections across the polished stone floor. Her silver hair caught the blue star's light as she watched the station horizon beyond the glass dome. Daniel slowed slightly but did not turn around. He simply walked over and leaned one hand against the terrace railing beside the fountain. "Morning," he said casually. The Queen glanced toward him. The palace cycle indicates this as morning according to human planetary rotation standards. Daniel smiled faintly. Close enough. They stood in quiet for a moment while the water flowed through the fountain channels in smooth circular patterns. Daniel eventually crouched beside the basin and watched the current carefully. Something about the motion caught his attention. The Queen noticed immediately. "You are observing the water system again." Daniel nodded slowly. "Just thinking." The Queen stepped closer. The fountain operates on a perfect closed-loop filtration design. Daniel leaned forward and dipped his fingers briefly into the cool stream. The water temperature was about 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The flow speed was steady but slightly uneven near one edge of the basin. He tilted his head slightly while studying the pattern. "Perfect systems usually look a little too perfect," he said quietly. The Queen watched the fountain surface. "This system has not failed in centuries." Daniel lifted his hand from the water and wiped the droplets on his jeans. "I believe that. But look there." He pointed toward a small swirl forming near the edge of the basin where the water hesitated before rejoining the main current. Tiny. Almost invisible unless someone stared at it long enough. The queen followed his gesture and focused her violet eyes on the pattern. For a moment neither of them spoke. Finally she said quietly, "The flow deviation is less than 1%. Daniel stood again and rested his arms lightly on the railing. 1% is how problems introduce themselves politely. The queen looked from the fountain to the human engineer beside her. Throughout the palace, quiet sensors continued recording every detail of the interaction. Daniel watched the swirl for another second before straightening his shoulders. "I will check the pump alignment later today," he added casually. Queen Seralith remained silent. Then she asked a question no analyst in the Valorian observation chambers had predicted this early in the trial. Human Daniel Carter. Daniel glanced at her. Yes. If the palace contained no imperfections at all, what would you do for 382 days? Daniel considered that carefully. Then he smiled faintly. I would probably start looking closer. The observation chambers across the Valorian Empire had grown unusually quiet during the following days of the trial. At first the analysts expected drama, confrontation, or some unpredictable display of emotional instability from the human representative. Instead the continuous feeds showed something far stranger. Daniel Carter fixing things. Not grand systems. Not imperial technologies. Small things. The palace had begun to change in ways the ancient station had not experienced in centuries. Door panels that once opened with a faint delay now slid smoothly along their tracks. Environmental regulators that previously fluctuated by half a degree now held a perfect 72 degrees Fahrenheit without correction. Even the fountain in the upper terrace flowed with a quieter, cleaner rhythm after Daniel had spent an hour adjusting a microscopic imbalance in the circulation pump beneath the stone floor. None of these repairs had been ordered. None were necessary for the palace to function. Yet the systems gradually became smoother under the attention of one patient human engineer who treated every mechanism as if it deserved respect. On the 8th day of the trial Daniel stood inside one of the deeper maintenance corridors beneath the central throne wing. The air down there smelled faintly of metal and ozone, and the corridor lights glowed with a dim amber tone designed for service drones rather than royal visitors. Daniel knelt beside an open access panel while his diagnostic scanner rested on the floor beside him. A quiet electrical relay clicked softly every few seconds inside the exposed junction box. The sound was harmless. But it was irregular. Daniel adjusted the alignment of a magnetic contact ring and listened again. Click. Pause. Click. There. Better. You continue to improve systems that have served the Empire reliably for generations. The voice echoed gently along the corridor behind him. Daniel did not need to turn around. Queen Seralith had begun appearing quietly in the places where he worked. He finished tightening the final contact screw before sitting back on his heels. Machines like attention, he said simply. The Queen stepped closer, her presence filling the narrow service passage with calm authority. These systems were designed to operate without human intervention. Daniel wiped his hands on a small cloth and looked at the exposed relay unit. I know. That is what makes them impressive. He closed the panel carefully and stood, lifting his scanner again. But every system eventually drifts a little from the way it started. The Queen studied him closely. Valorian engineers believe perfection is achieved through design. Daniel slung the tool bag over his shoulder. Human engineers believe perfection is achieved through maintenance. They walked together through the corridor for several steps in thoughtful silence. Above them the palace moved through the endless quiet of space while the blue stars slowly brightened along the station horizon. Finally the Queen spoke again. Throughout the galaxy many civilizations are observing your behavior. Daniel nodded once. I figured. Most of them expected something else from the human representative. Daniel smiled faintly as they reached the corridor lift. Yeah. Probably something dramatic. Queen Seralith looked directly at him now, her violet eyes steady and curious. Instead they see you repairing water pumps and door mechanisms. Daniel rested one hand against the lift panel and shrugged. Someone has to take care of the small things. The lift doors opened with a whisper and soft light spilled into the corridor. The Queen remained standing for a moment before stepping inside with him. High above them the palace gardens waited in the growing light of the artificial morning. As the lift began rising toward the upper levels, the ancient systems of the Valorian station continued running more smoothly than they had in centuries. And somewhere deep inside the Imperial observation chambers a realization was beginning to form among the watchers. The human experiment was not revealing how powerful humanity could be. It was revealing something far more difficult to measure. Why humans cared about things that no one else even noticed. The realization did not arrive with alarms or dramatic announcements across the Valorian Empire. It arrived quietly, the way most important truths do. Nearly 3 weeks into the trial the palace station moved through a calm arc of space while the blue star outside the great observation dome burned steadily against the black horizon. Inside the upper garden terrace Daniel Carter sat beside the fountain he had repaired days earlier, one elbow resting on his knee while he slowly sketched something in the weathered notebook he carried everywhere. The fountain water moved in a perfectly balanced circle now, the current flowing with a smooth clarity that reflected the glass dome above like a second sky. Sensors throughout the palace recorded another system running slightly more efficiently than it had before the human arrived. Daniel noticed none of the monitoring devices. He was focused on the small diagram forming on the page, a redesign for the filtration valve beneath the basin that would reduce energy consumption by 3%. It was a tiny improvement. But tiny improvements were what engineers understood best. A soft step approached across the stone floor behind him. Queen Seralith stood beside the fountain again, her tall silhouette framed by the glow of the artificial morning cycle. For several seconds she simply watched the human working with quiet concentration. "You continue modifying systems that were already considered optimal," she said finally. Daniel looked up and smiled faintly before closing the notebook. Optimal is just a word people use when they stop looking for better ideas. The Queen studied him carefully. Across the galaxy the observation networks continued transmitting the moment to thousands of research chambers and diplomatic halls. "Human Daniel Carter," she said slowly, "the Valorian Council expected this trial to reveal whether a human could endure the pressures of living beside imperial authority." Daniel leaned back slightly against the edge of the fountain. "And what did you find?" The Queen looked toward the palace skyline beyond the glass dome where distant ships drifted like quiet stars. "We discovered something unexpected." Daniel waited patiently. Queen Seralith turned her violet eyes back toward him. "You did not attempt to impress the Empire. You did not attempt to challenge it. Instead you repaired its doors, balanced its water flow, and listened to machines no one else noticed." Daniel gave a small shrug. "That is the job." The Queen considered that answer for a long moment. Throughout the palace the ancient systems hummed with a steadiness they had not achieved in centuries. Finally she spoke again, her voice softer now. "The galaxy believed humanity would demonstrate power." Daniel picked up the notebook again and tapped it lightly against his knee. "Power is easy. Keeping things working is harder." The Queen looked out at the quiet star once more. In the reflection of the glass dome she could see the human sitting calmly beside the fountain, just another technician. Making small improvements in a universe that rarely noticed small things. And in that reflection she understood something the observers had only begun to suspect. Humanity had never been remarkable because of strength or technology. Humanity was remarkable because when a system began to drift, when something small and fragile needed attention, a human would simply kneel down beside it and try to make it better. The water in the fountain continued its quiet